Okay, well, good morning, or actually, we'll say afternoon now, to everybody for our Get Connected series. We will be recording this because this is a very important, especially a very important webinar that we're having today with an update from an expert on the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially with a focus on vaccines. First of all, my name is Anna Wishart, and I am Director of Partnerships with Beyond School Bells, which is Nebraska's after school and summer learning network. And with us today is also the team from the Department of Education as well. And again, we're really excited for this Get Connected because it's very important for you as kids are coming into summer learning and fall learning experiences, and they and their families and your staff have questions about the pandemic and about vaccines, that you listen today. And we have some questions and answer session with Dr. Mark Rupp. So let me give you a quick bio on the expert we have today with us. And I am so excited. He works with the University of Nebraska Medical Center. We are lucky in Nebraska to have this prestigious world-class institute that leads not only our state, but the world on infectious diseases, and has been one of the key players last year and this year on helping our country and our world battle the COVID-19 pandemic. So a little bit about Dr. Rupp. He is a professor and chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases in the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He is the medical director of the Nebraska Medical Center's Department of Infection Control and Epidemiology. Dr. Rupp received his medical degree from Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, and he holds a BS degree in chemical engineering from the University of Texas in Austin. He underwent an internship and residency training in internal medicine and completed fellowship training in infectious diseases at the Virginia Commonwealth University. He is a diplomat, American Board of Internal Medicine in the subspecialty area of infectious diseases, and he is also a fellow of the American College of Physicians, the Infectious Disease Society of America, and the Society of Hospital Epidemiology of America. He is a past president of SHEA, and he has served as a consultant for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, NIH, and VA. He recently served as the chief of staff at Nebraska Medicine, and he's published over 450 articles, chapters, and abstracts, and frequently presents papers at national and international meetings, serves as a guest lecturer, and is an active teacher and researcher. Dr. Rupp's research interests are in the areas of healthcare, associated infections, and antimicrobial stewardship. And again, we are so lucky today to have him on this recorded webinar talk to us in particular about COVID-19 and the vaccine. Dr. Rupp, welcome, and we are glad to have you.
Thank you, Senator Wishart, for that very gracious introduction. And I'll attempt to share my screen here, and then we can get started. All right, hopefully you're seeing the full screen version of the slides, and we're going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 vaccination. I'm going to start off by giving just a little bit of a update on the status of the pandemic, but for the most part, we'll be talking about vaccination. And as Dr. Wishart had mentioned, none of us had an interest in COVID-19 a couple years ago because we didn't know it existed. And so I've sort of had to become an expert on the fly, if you will, here over the last year or so. So these are my potential conflicts of interest. I am serving as a co-investigator on a vaccine trial, and I hope to be the principal investigator on a trial that we'll have coming here through the Nebraska Medical Center here in the coming months. And I have served as a consultant to 3M, which makes some of the PPE or personal protective equipment that people have been using throughout the pandemic. My goal is to give you a very fair and balanced and non-tainted presentation. If you guys do discern some sort of industrial taint to what I'm presenting, by all means, call me out on that. And if you have evaluations, fill those out. And certainly that's not my intent. So we're going to start off by just talking a little bit about the pandemic and the status. This is data from the Johns Hopkins tracking service. And one of the really good things about this whole pandemic is that it's been very transparent as far as the information that's available to the public. And so anybody can go on to any of these websites and actually see exactly what I see and react to what I'm having to react to as well. So this clearly shows the global nature of the pandemic, with the countries that are having the greatest number of cases here right in the United States, but obviously some real ongoing problems with India and Brazil, countries within Europe as well. And then many of the other countries are probably having large outbreaks as well, but in certain countries in Latin America and Africa, we really just don't have the surveillance data to know how many cases they've had. Here in the United States, we're up to about 33 million cases, approaching 600,000 deaths, with somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30,000 cases per day being described in the United States, and about 600 deaths per day that continue to occur. I would encourage people to continue to have a worldwide view on this pandemic, because indeed we are in this together with all humans throughout the globe. This is particularly true as we talk about the vaccine and the potential for the development of escape variants, which would be viruses that have the capability of invading human defenses or the immunologic protection that we could potentially develop from a vaccine. So again, it's in everybody's best interest to get this pandemic under control and to get as many human beings vaccinated as we possibly can throughout the world. This is the epidemic curve here in the United States. As you can see, kind of at the beginning of April, I was very, very concerned, and we were seeing variants take off throughout the United States, and I thought that we were on the verge of having another large pandemic surge. Now, luckily, this has not materialized. And in fact, you can see really over the last several weeks, we've had a falling rate within the United States. I think this directly affects the effectiveness of the vaccine and the fact that we have been pretty successful in the country of getting this vaccination distributed widely throughout the country, and really has had a tremendous impact. Now, in the middle portion of the slide, you can see the tests that are being done, the hospitalizations and the deaths. Deaths tend to be a lagging indicator. You can see that's kind of lagging behind the pandemic curve, but nonetheless is also drifting downward, which is really gratifying. Now, this map shows the hotspots here in the United States, and although Nebraska is primarily in the green, which is the desirable color, you can see you don't really have to go very far to see some areas that are not doing as well. So Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota, some areas in the Dakotas, some of the Northwest and some of the Northeast, as well as South Florida, are all pretty hot still. And I think this indicates that, we still can have regional outbreaks, and we'll continue to be at risk for this. I hope that if we can continue to distribute vaccine throughout our communities in Nebraska, that we will not see an additional surge of widespread activity. But with the variants that continue to emerge, and with really a lot of people yet needing to be vaccinated, it is certainly possible that we could see things heat up again. Now, these show the epidemic curves here in Nebraska. On the left-hand side of the slide, shows the number of cases. As you can see, again, the trends are all in the right direction. We are drifting downward, having about 200 cases per day in Nebraska, which equates to about 10 cases per 100,000 per day, which is still way too high for us to get complacent. I think really we would need to be at least half that, and preferably somewhere in the neighborhood of just a couple cases per 100,000 per day for us to really feel like we have things confidently in hand. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see hospitalizations, and that's just kind of plateaued off here for the last several months. Still, people are getting sick, people are getting hospitalized, but it's not nearly what we were seeing at the end of 2020, when we had nearly 1,000 persons in the hospital throughout the state. Now it's typically 100 to 150 persons. And then you can see the percent of positive cases on the lower portion of the slide. And again, trends are in the right place, 4 to 5% positivity. And these are the types of data that I look at pretty much on a daily basis to try to assess where we're at with the pandemic. And then this is data a little bit closer to home, at least for me, in Douglas County. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide in the multicolored column bar, the cases that we're seeing in Douglas County. And the fact that, again, trends really over for about the last 4 to 5 weeks are all drifting downward. This is great. We still have about 10 cases per 100,000 per day, as you can see on the left-hand portion of the slide. And then I think something that would be interesting to this audience is really to look at this last several colored bars. And you can see that where we're seeing the cases is not in our very elderly patients, those who are 65 and above, but they're tending to be in our younger adults. And so you can see, in the yellow and the orange bars, we're talking about people in their 20s and teens, the red bar being those in their 30s. So this is where, unfortunately, we continue to have gaps in our vaccination and where we need to be working all that more diligently to try to make sure that all age groups now, other than our youngest, are vaccinated. As people, I think, know, everybody down to the age of 12 now is indicated to getting a vaccine. And then the last thing we'll talk about before we move into a little bit more specific information on vaccination is just the emergence of the variants throughout the United States. Now, this data is pretty old, but it's the most recent data that we have from the CDC. But what I think you can appreciate is in that bar graph on the left-hand side is the really explosive growth in this sort of peach-colored, orange-colored bar, which represents the B.1.1.7 variant. This is the variant that emerged and was described initially in the UK, and then has become the predominant strain really throughout the United States. There are a number of other variants that we are also very concerned about. There's one that is called the P variant that is out of Brazil. There's a B.1.351 variant that's out of South Africa. And then we also have some homegrown variants here in the United States, out of New York and out of California, that we're likewise keeping a close eye on. The reason that all of these variants are of concern is that they have demonstrated an increase in their transmissibility. The way these variants occur is that they get mutations largely in what we call the spike protein. The spike protein is what enables this virus to bind to our cells. And the mutations in the spike protein are allowing that binding to occur either more easily or more avidly, and resulting in a virus that can be transmitted from one person to another more readily. In addition, some of these variants have increasing severity of disease. And so there's some indicators that the severity of illness can be worse with people being hospitalized or losing their lives more frequently when they're infected with some of these variants. Now, luckily, the variants continue to be susceptible and protected by the vaccine, although we've seen some erosion of that protection in some of the variants. But again, they appear to be very, very effective, and we'll talk a little bit more about this more specifically in just a few moments. But they appear to be very, very effective. We are very assured of the safety profile of these vaccines now, and they are protecting us against these variants that are emerging both here at home as well in other far-flung corners of the world. So it just continues to be all that much more important to continue to vaccinate people, to continue to get that protection, and to continue to really push these pandemic curves downward so that we can take care of our kids in our programs, get them back to school, in face-to-face learning safely, and really open up throughout society. So this is our chance, this is our tool to achieve that goal. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more specifically about the vaccine so that you guys can be fully armed with information. You can feel like you're really good advocates for vaccination. So when you talk to your parents of kids who are now eligible for vaccination, that you feel like you have the information that you need to administer that message. So this is information from the New York Times, which shows really just the huge number of vaccines that are still being looked at, are being considered, are being studied. There's 113 vaccines in various human studies right now, 77 preclinical vaccines. I think that this is great, that we need to continue to push forward with developing additional vaccines, because quite frankly, we just don't know whether one of these other vaccines is going to be more effective. It might be more effective in certain populations. So for instance, maybe kids react better to one type of vaccine than another. There might be vaccines with less of a side effect profile. They may be longer lasting. They may be more convenient for storage or for administration. So there's a lot of good reasons to continue to develop the vaccines. And I'm pleased to say that there are many that are coming forward. Now, the vaccines that you've heard the most about are probably the mRNA vaccines, as you can see in this slide, with the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine being those that are approved for use here in the United States through emergency use authorization. There are also what's known as viral vector vaccines. The J&J vaccine is an example of the adenovirus vectored vaccine. And then the AstraZeneca vaccine that is used in many other parts of the world is likewise an adenovirus vectored vaccine. And we'll talk about how these work here in just a moment. Now, we also have some more traditional approaches to vaccine development that are ongoing. The Novavax vaccine is probably the closest that is ready for evaluation and approval. Now, their data is not completed. They've not submitted it to the FDA, but this is a very traditional protein-based with an adjuvant type of vaccine that is very tried and true with regard to other infectious diseases. Side effect and toxicity profile are generally very, very good. And so we're encouraged that this vaccine is very, very far along with its evaluation process. I would guess that they will get their data finished up here sometime this summer and get this submitted to the FDA for further evaluation. And then you can also see the last category of vaccination would be attenuated or inactivated virus. So this is, again, a very old approach to vaccine development where you actually take the virus and either weaken it or kill it, and then give the virus back to humans so that they can see a weakened or killed form of the vaccine and potentially respond to that. So how does the mRNA vaccine work? That's what's shown in this slide. And this is technology that, although is relatively newly applied to vaccination. So these are the first mRNA vaccines that have been used broadly in humans. The technology has actually been around for a long time and has been in development for a long time. So I know that some people have been scared off a little bit about this because, oh, this is brand new technology and it hasn't been evaluated fully. Really, that's not true. The technology has been in development for years and years. There are approaches of using mRNA vaccine to some other types of illness. And so this is, making use of the mRNA technology productively, but it has been in development for quite some time. But the bottom line is that you take a piece of what's known as messenger RNA. And so this is just simply the instructions that your cells would be using to create a protein. And so your cells are given the instruction to make a little bit of the coronavirus spike protein. And as I mentioned, spike protein is very, very important in the pathogenesis of disease. So it's the spike protein that allows the virus to adhere to your cells, and it's the first step in the causing of disease. So if you form antibodies against the spike protein, it prevents the virus from starting that infectious process. So again, you give a little mRNA, it's taken up into the cells see the message, your machinery to make proteins responds to that message by making some spike protein, and then your body sees the spike protein and develops antibodies directed against it. Now this slide shows that same process just a little bit more in depth. So here you've got the messenger RNA encapsulated in a lipid nanoparticle. And so the lipids are just like a little globule of fat, if you will. And that's what allows the mRNA to be delivered to your cells. So your cells take up this little lipid nanoparticle into the cell. The mRNA is then translated into spike protein, and you can see the red sort of things on the outside of the cell. That's the spike protein that is then presented to what's known as B cells and certain populations of T cells. When it's presented to the B cell, you make the neutralizing antibody. And when it's presented to certain immunological cells, the T cells, we hope that this results in long-lasting memory. And so again, your body is fully primed now to fight the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, if it ever sees it naturally. And this is the way that, that you become immune. And so kind of the way I've tried to tell people how vaccines work is that you can envision your immunologic system as being kind of a guard. And your guard is sitting outside your home, trying to keep invaders and you know, the bad guys from coming into your house. Now, the guard has a sidearm, but the sidearm is not fully loaded and the guard has not been fully trained. So by giving a vaccine, what you're doing is you're training your guard. You're getting their sidearm loaded, and you're teaching them to recognize the person who's trying to invade your home. So now they're ready to respond upon a moment's notice. Now, if you haven't vaccinated, you still have your guard and they're still there and they're still ready to do their job, but they've never encountered that invader and they don't fully recognize him at first and they don't recognize him as being dangerous. And so it takes them a while to get their gun loaded and to recognize them as being a potential bad guy. Now, if you have, if you're immunosuppressed, you've got a sleepy guard and your guard has fallen asleep on the job and allows the invader to sneak into your house unannounced. And if you have an autoimmune disease, well, your guard is just too jumpy. And so your guard is kind of shooting in the night and sometimes hitting the target and sometimes not. So again, giving the vaccine is just simply a way to, you know, get your guard educated and trained and armed and ready to respond. So that's kind of one simple way to kind of tell people, you know, a way to think about the vaccines and their immunologic system. Now, the mRNA vaccines are very sensitive to environmental conditions. They're pretty fragile, quite frankly. And so that's why the Pfizer vaccine has needed to be maintained in very, very low temperatures. And the Moderna vaccine has to be also kept at normal freezer temperatures. But you can't have these things just shipped in the mail and you know, thawing out, because they will degrade very, very quickly. Now, both of these vaccines require a priming dose and then a booster dose. And so for the Pfizer vaccine, at 3 weeks, you get your booster, and at Moderna, you get that 4 weeks later. Both vaccines are amazingly effective, and they're about 95% effective in preventing clinical COVID-19 and nearly 100% effective in preventing really serious illness, hospitalization, and death. So this is a home run, quite frankly. If you guys remember, back a few months ago, before these vaccines and before the data from the studies was available, we were talking about if we could get a vaccine that was 60% or 70% effective, we would be very, very happy. These vaccines are a home run. I mean, these are 95% effective, nearly 100% effective in preventing serious illness. But I would also point out they're not 100% effective. There's no vaccine, there's no medicine that's 100% effective. And so we do fully expect to see a few people who've been vaccinated continue to develop illness. Now, again, for the most part, that illness is much less severe, and very, very few people who've been vaccinated develop severe illness, need to be hospitalized, or lose their lives to this disease. Now, both vaccines are commonly associated with mild self-limited side effects and some toxicity. Again, there's no medicine that I can prescribe. There's no vaccine that can be given that isn't without some rare associated adverse events. And that's true with this vaccine as well. Now, nearly everybody who gets the vaccine will have some sore arms. And, you know, I can attest from getting the vaccine, yeah, the next day, my arm was pretty doggone sore, but it goes away pretty quickly. In addition, about somewhere in the neighborhood of a third to a half of people who get the vaccine will have some self-limited mild systemic side effects. That's usually feeling just kind of out of sorts. You have some malaise, you have some fatigue. Sometimes you get a little bit of muscle aches, sometimes some low-grade fevers, some headaches. These symptoms tend to be mild. They tend to go away without any other medications within about a day or two. And so again, when you look at the overall risk-benefit ratio for these vaccines, it's far in favor of getting the vaccine and putting up with a day or so of feeling a little bit of fatigue, rather than the real potential for getting severe COVID-19 or what we're seeing all too frequently, the long-lasting effects of COVID-19 with the months of brain fog, of fatigue, of malaise, of muscle aches, of fevers, of people not being able to go back to school, not being able to get back to their jobs. And so all those things can be avoided if we are vaccinating persons. And obviously, the nearly 600,000 people who have died in this country since the start of the pandemic, those deaths, those hospitalizations can be largely prevented. Now, this is data from the phase 3 trial for the Pfizer vaccine, and it looks very, very similar with the Moderna vaccine. And what it shows is that these were large phase 3 trials, is what we call these. These were rigorously performed, placebo-controlled, double-blinded trials in which people either got the vaccine or a placebo. We didn't know if they got the vaccine. They didn't know if they got the vaccine. And then they were followed very, very closely over several months. And what you can see is that the blue line in this graph shows the number of people getting sick with the placebo group compared to the vaccine group shown by the red line. And you can see that right at about day 10 to 14, you have a divergence of these curves. And so what that indicates is that with the first shot, in about 10 to 14 days, you start having good levels of protection. And you'll see that this is really just almost flat. That there is very, very solid protection with the first dose of the vaccine. Now, we think that we get longer lasting immunologic protection with the booster dose. And so that's why it's important that, at 3 or 4 weeks, people get that booster dose so that we are able to make sure that they have long lasting immunity from this viral infection. Again, these were large phase 3 trials, tens of thousands of persons that were enrolled in the studies. And so I would reassure people that, say again, look, this was just developed too quickly. We just don't know about it. These trials did not cut corners. They, looked at people rigorously over months, and they didn't cut corners on these studies. Now, I will freely admit and be the first person to say, we don't have years of experience with this like we do for other vaccines that have come out, but we have months and months of data now, hundreds of millions of doses that have been given. The side effect and toxicity profile is really very well known. And with all other prior vaccines, if you are going to have a problem with them, you typically will know that within just a few weeks, if not just within a month or so. There are no examples that I know of people getting vaccinated and then years later having some sort of problem from the vaccine. So again, people who say, we just don't have enough experience with this, really, I think, are not looking at the data, don't know how vaccines work. And really, I have no concerns that a year or two from now, we're going to find some weird, unusual kind of problem associated with these vaccines. If that was going to occur, we would have seen it. And again, after millions of doses of these vaccines being distributed, we're pretty confident of what they look like. Now, again, people do get side effects from the vaccine, and this shows the people who are a little bit younger who were in the trials. And so again, the side effects tend to be more pronounced when you're younger, and they tend to be more pronounced after the second dose. And so this is the worst data that I can show you. This is in the data in the younger people after the second dose. And what you can see is with the local reactions, these were pretty frequently seen. So about 70 to 80% of people are going to have a sore arm. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the side effects from the vaccine compared to the placebo. And this would be fever, fatigue, headaches, chills, etc. And one thing I'd point out to you is that there's actually about 20 to 25% of people who received the placebo that had these adverse events as well. So you guys know how often you get a little bit of a headache, or you get a little bit of, you feel tired, or you get a little muscle ache. That's exactly what we saw with the placebo patients in the trials as well. But you can see that, again, people who got the real vaccine did have about twice as much of some of these mild side effects than the people who received the placebo. So again, I don't try to hide this. I tell people that, a third to a half of the time, you're going to have some mild self-limited symptoms that tend to go away on their own. Again, this is a small price to pay for being fully protected against this really potentially lethal infection. Okay, so now let's turn to the viral vector vaccines, the adenovirus vaccines like the J&J vaccine. So these are a little bit different than the mRNA vaccines. And so they actually use a virus, a simple cold virus that causes, an upper respiratory infection, to deliver a little bit of the viral DNA to your cells. And so again, here's the viral vector, here's the adenovirus. The adenovirus has been engineered to be replication deficient. So that means that the adenovirus can't cause an infection itself. It's not going to cause you to have, a cold or any other kind of problem. So the adenovirus is taken up into the cell, as is shown here. The DNA then is transcribed and translated into RNA and then protein, and then you make a little bit of the spike protein shown by these little red globular looking things on the outside of the cell. So it's very similar to how the mRNA vaccine works, but instead of delivering the mRNA message, they're actually delivering the DNA information to your cell. The DNA is then transcribed and translated so that you make the spike protein. And from there, it's very much like the mRNA vaccines. So again, the spike protein is presented to B cells and T cells so that you get an immunologic response. You form the neutralizing antibodies directed towards the spike protein, as well as getting hopefully the long-lasting immunity from the T cell responses. Now, the vaccine that is available here in the United States, that's one of these adenovirus vectored vaccines, is the J&J, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It was approved for emergency use back at the end of February. Again, as I've already told you, it uses a replication incompetent adenovirus vector vaccine to deliver the DNA. One of the real advantages with the J&J vaccine is that it can be given as just a single dose rather than need a priming and a booster dose. You can store it at normal refrigerator temperatures because it is much more environmentally hardy. And it, like the Moderna vaccine, is indicated for persons 18 years of age and older. When the Pfizer vaccine first came out, it was indicated for those who were 16 years of age and older. And then, as you guys know, last week it was expanded to those who are 12 to 16 years of age as well. Now, the efficacy of the J&J vaccine, very similar to what we saw with the mRNA vaccine. Again, large phase 3 studies done in multiple countries. And the important part with the J&J vaccine is that part of the study was done in Brazil and part in South Africa, where they were seeing some of these variants emerge. And despite that, the vaccine looked like it was fairly efficacious, that it worked fairly well. And you can see that data here for subgroup analysis by country in preventing severe and clinical disease at 14 days and 28 days is, about 80 to 85% in the US. In Brazil, about 82 to 87%. In South Africa, in the 70s and 80%. So again, across the board, very effective, maybe not quite as effective as the mRNA vaccines, but the issue there is that these studies were not head-to-head comparisons, okay? So you weren't comparing the Pfizer vaccine to the J&J vaccine. And so any comparison that's done in saying that one vaccine is better than the other really is just not a fair assessment of that. They're not done in head-to-head trials. In addition, the J&J vaccine were done at times when there was a larger amount of disease circulating in its communities, and there were some of the variants. So again, I'm bullish on all these vaccines. I think all of them work quite well, and saying that one is effective more than another, I think you really just can't make those statements at the current time. Now, this shows very data similar to what we saw with the mRNA vaccines. And so again, here's the efficiency or the efficacy and the effectiveness of the vaccine, the placebo control shown by the little gray circles, and the people who got vaccinated by the blue circles. And so again, what you can see is that at about 2 weeks, you see these curves really diverge, showing the effectiveness of getting the J&J vaccine. Now, here are the local side effects and toxicity. Again, very much like the mRNA vaccines, all vaccines are going to be associated with some degree of side effects and toxicity. The left-hand portion of the slide shows the local effects. And so again, most people, and this is young people, 18 to 60 and then over 60, showing local adverse events. And so you can see again, pain being more prominent in the younger folks than the older folks. And then the upper part of the graph compares them to the people who receive placebo. So again, about 20% of the folks who got the placebo had a little bit of localized pain, and about 40 to 60% of the folks who got the real vaccine had the localized pain. The systemic side effects, again, same schema. The upper portion of the figure is the people who received the vaccine. The lower portion are the folks who received the placebo. And again, you can see that a sizable number of the folks who received placebo, 20, 30, 40%, reported some of these same side effects, like fatigue, headache, myalgias, nausea. But you can see again that they are more prominent amongst the folks who received the active vaccine. So you may be able to say that getting the J&J vaccine is maybe just a little bit less prone to side effects than the mRNA vaccines. But again, both of them are very, very well tolerated and have a very, very good safety profile. Now, one thing that has come to light within recent weeks with the J&J vaccine, and also with a similar vaccine used in Europe, the AstraZeneca vaccine, is that rarely, very rarely, you'll see what's known as cerebral venous sinus thrombosis in people who have received the J&J vaccine. And what I would emphasize to you right off the bat is, number one, this is rare. And number two, we're not seeing this with the mRNA vaccines. So people who have concern about this side effect or this adverse event can get the mRNA vaccines and really take this off of their list of considerations. Now, what we're seeing in rare instances is people developing clots in the venous system that drains the brain and the central nervous system. So obviously this is serious. So you get a clot in this area of your body, it can cause some central nervous system problems. Now, this is the data that came to light after about 7 or 8 million doses had been administered throughout the United States. And so one thing I would also emphasize to people is that the reporting system is working. So in some of these rare side effects, you're not going to see them until millions of people have been vaccinated. And the reporting system picked this up quickly. And the FDA and the CDC responded to this, I think, in a very responsible manner, putting a pause on vaccination, looking at the data carefully, and then coming out with some revised recommendations. So this is the data that they were looking at late in April, where you see cases of the thrombocytopenia with thrombosis syndrome. And what that means is that these people who had clots also had a decrease in their platelet count. And that's very unusual to see those combination of things together, decreasing platelets and a clot. And so that's what really raised the alarm system that, you know, this could be associated with the vaccine. And so what you can see is the number of cases that were defined and then reporting them per million doses given. And so in younger women, 30 to 39 and 40 to 49, as well as 18 to 30, you can see that the risk of these clots developing, was expressed as a few cases per million doses of vaccine delivered. Now, this puts the thrombosis in a little bit better context for you so that you can evaluate what your risk is. So this was data supplied by J&J to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices in the CDC. And what it shows is some of the toxicity associated with previous vaccines. And so for folks who have heard of the rotavirus vaccine, you get about 16 to 69 cases of intussusception, which can be serious, meaning that your bowel kind of kinks, if you will. Immune thrombocytopenia with the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is 26 cases per million doses. Guillain-Barré syndrome with the H1N1 vaccine was about 3 per million cases. And anaphylaxis for any vaccine is about 1 per million. Now, a drug-induced complication, which bears some resemblance to the thrombosis associated with the J&J vaccine, is what's known as heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. And this is seen in anywhere from about 1,000 to 50,000 persons per million persons who are given heparin as a therapy. And heparin is an anticoagulant. And so all of these side effects from vaccine would be regarded as very rare. And this includes the thrombosis or thrombocytopenia. And what you can see is that you get about, if you look at all comers, about 2 cases per million people that was described to the CDC. And in a very recent update, just last week, a full 28 cases have now been described in about 9 million recipients of vaccine. So that's about 3 persons per million vaccine recipients. Again, very rare, but something that people need to be aware of. And so the CDC and the FDA brought out warnings to people and to their clinicians saying that you can see this thrombosis or thrombocytopenia rarely. And then I've underlined, this is my emphasis added, that women aged 18 to 50 have seen these cases more frequently and that it can be severe. And that you don't want to use heparin if you see these patients clinically. And so there are some instructions to clinicians that they need to be aware of. And then likewise, if somebody develops shortness of breath, chest pain, leg swelling, or persistent abdominal pain or neurologic symptoms, or what's known as petechiae, which are little tiny bruises beyond the site of vaccination, these should be alerting symptoms to clinicians that they should consider this as a possible side effect of the vaccine. And so what I'm telling clinicians and the public is that if you're a younger woman, you're concerned about the rare risk of potential thrombosis associated with this vaccine, then you should go get the mRNA vaccine. If you are a man, if you don't fit in the age group that we see these predominantly, your risk from the J&J vaccine is even smaller than it is with women. But again, if you're a young woman and you're concerned about this, then I think it's reasonable to seek out a different form of vaccine. And then lastly, there are ways of reporting vaccine adverse events. Anybody can go online and report these things, particularly important for clinicians to know this. And so this data and this vaccine adverse event reporting system has been widely disseminated so that we can report these things as we see them. Okay, as I kind of wind down, I want to just go through some specific questions and concerns about vaccination. Should vaccine be given to pregnant women? Pregnant women have not been studied extensively for this vaccine, and so it is not a recommended vaccine for women, but it is recommended that this vaccine be available to pregnant women. Okay, so what the FDA is saying and what the professional groups that take care of pregnant women are saying is that they don't believe there's any reason for the mRNA vaccines to be dangerous for pregnant women or their developing babies, but it has not been as well studied as would need to be to make it a recommended vaccine. Now, I would also point out that there are lots of vaccines that are recommended in pregnancy. And so, this may be the next one that becomes a recommended vaccine. Right now, again, should be available. Women need to, discuss this with their obstetricians and with their primary care docs and decide if they want to go forward with vaccine. What I would relate is that the absolute risk of COVID-19 for pregnant women is low, but it is clearly higher than the general population. So if you're a woman who's pregnant or you're wanting to get pregnant, you need to realize that COVID-19 is a serious illness for you, even more so than a normal person who's not pregnant. And this is some data that just came out within the last week or two to emphasize that. So this is about the biggest cohort study that I'm aware of, involved 43 institutions, 18 countries, 700 pregnant women matched very closely to 1,400 pregnant women without COVID-19. And what they saw was pretty much everything you looked at was more likely adverse in women who were pregnant and had COVID-19 than pregnant women without COVID-19. And one of the things that is particularly of concern with women is will they have a premature delivery? And what you can see in this curve at the right-hand portion of the slide is the blue line is the pregnant women who had symptomatic COVID-19. And what you can see is that it's different than the line that's either orange or gray, which is the women with asymptomatic disease or the women who were not infected. And what this means is that you do have an increased risk of having premature delivery if you have symptomatic COVID-19. again, presumably could be prevented by getting vaccinated prior to getting pregnant, or we again think that vaccination with pregnancy is probably okay. Now, this is a little bit of data to back up that statement that I just made, to say that vaccination is probably okay. And I do say probably because, again, we just don't have enough experience. But the conclusion from this study that involved about 36,000 pregnant women who were vaccinated said that preliminary findings did not show any obvious safety signals among pregnant women who received the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. However, more study is necessary. Okay, so, again, I think we need to be transparent about this, that we do need to look at this. Now, the graphic part of this slide shows the toxicity or adverse events associated with the vaccine. And you can see both the Pfizer on top and the Moderna vaccine below that. And the bottom line for this was that localized symptoms, so the injection site pain, looked like it was a little bit more frequent in pregnant women, but all of the other symptoms associated with the vaccine, so the muscle aches and the headache and the just feeling bad and feeling fatigue, actually seemed to be a little bit less in pregnant women. And so you can see the pregnant women in the dark blue bars and the the non-pregnant women in the lighter blue bars. And what you can see is, again, that in pregnant women with dark blue, they tend to be a little bit less for both mRNA, for the Pfizer, as well as the Moderna, for those systemic side effects. So again, reassuring information, but not data where you can say, hey, this is a recommended vaccine if you're pregnant. Okay, next question. Should the vaccines be given to immune-compromised persons? The answer to that is yes. We don't know of anything that would suggest that these vaccines are dangerous for immune-compromised persons, but we don't know how well they work. Okay, so again, the studies did not include large groups of people who were status post-organ transplant or were in cancer chemotherapy or something like that. What we are seeing is that the vaccines probably don't work as well in that group of patients, which is really of no surprise. But again, we don't know of any reason that they shouldn't get the vaccine, that it would be dangerous for them. Does the mRNA vaccine cause female sterility? This is kind of an oddball concern that people have. And the scientific connection between these is that there is a little piece of the spike protein, very, very small, that has sequence homology, meaning that they look the same, compared to a protein that is found in the placenta. Now, the area of homology is so small that your body would not make specific antibody directed against that homologous sequence. And so there's really nobody that voices any concern, that is knowledgeable about this, that this causes female sterility. And then furthermore, what I would point out is that if you do believe this argument, that somehow the vaccine is going to prompt antibody formation against this small piece of the spike protein, you would have the same danger if you got the infection. And so we know the infection is out there widely. And so again, you not only would have this risk of developing antibody to the placenta, but you would have all the other bad things that are associated with the infection itself. The bad infections, the deaths, the lingering symptoms, all that kind of stuff. So you can prevent all those things with the vaccination. So I know that's a kind of a complex argument, but I guess the bottom line I would like to say is there's just no reasonable information to suggest that this vaccine causes any problems with reproduction in men or women. And so again, I think this is kind of a bogus argument, but again, it's out there and it's taken on a life of its own, and it's been just incredibly amplified by social media. Should the mRNA vaccine be given to pediatric age patients? So this is particularly important to this audience. And so what you can see in this slide is, again, just here in the last week or so, May 10th, the FDA evaluated this information, the CDC evaluated this information, and came out with the same level of authorization for kids age 12 to 16 as we have now in adults. And so this study was done in about 2,000 children. And what was found in it was that the vaccine protected kids essentially 100% from developing COVID-19. Again, it's a little bit smaller study, than the adult age studies, but also showed a very good adverse event profile. And so you can see that data at the bottom portion of this slide, that kids aged 12 through 15 for the Pfizer vaccine had, almost all of them had some arm pain. And then you can see that about 60, 70%, somewhere in that neighborhood, had some of the systemic side effects that we see in adults. So again, there's a pretty good chance that if you give your kid a vaccine, that the next day they're going to be cranky, they're going to have a little headache, a little muscle ache, they're going to feel tired. But again, those things are self-limited, go away within a day or two. So the recommendation is that kids should get vaccinated. Okay, so now let's talk in the last few minutes a little bit about how we're combating vaccine hesitancy. And unfortunately, this is exactly what we're seeing in the United States now. So this curve on the left-hand side shows the average number of cases per day given in the United States, to a point that a few weeks ago we were giving somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 to 2.5 million, almost 3 million doses a day. And you can see that that has now drifted down to the point where we're about 2 million doses per day. And this is true for both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, that have drifted downward. And the J&J vaccine, as they got the pause put on, obviously went to 0 and then has started coming up a little bit. So the bottom line is that we now, unfortunately, are in this situation in this country where we have more doses than people who are willing to accept them. And we need to continue to work really, really hard on trying to get people vaccinated. This is a map throughout the United States on the left-hand side showing those that have received at least 1 dose. And the map on the right-hand side are the people who are fully vaccinated, where the darker colors are better. The bottom line is that throughout the United States, about half the population, 47%, have received at least 1 dose. And this is data that I updated this weekend. And about 120 million people are fully vaccinated, or a little over a third. For our elderly people over the age of 65, you can see that 84% have received at least 1 dose, and about 71% have received full vaccination. In Nebraska, 45% with 1 dose, 40% or a little bit less than 40% fully vaccinated, and a little over 50% of those over the age of 16. So that's why last week you saw the big PR campaign that over half the people in Nebraska have been vaccinated. That's not exactly true. It's 50% of those aged over 16. And so again, we really need to think about the kids as part of the overall population, and we need to get everybody vaccinated who is now qualified to get vaccinated. That includes now kids 12 to 16 years of age. Okay, so how are we going to combat vaccine hesitancy? Well, we need to make the vaccine more convenient. We need to fight misinformation. We need to push back against the distrust because of past abuse. We need to somehow do something to defuse politicization of public health. And we need to get people to understand that they are sometimes being manipulated without their knowledge. Okay, so for convenience, up until now, we've had the vaccine available, but people had to go to the vaccine. They largely had to take action. They had to sign up to get an appointment. They had to go to a mass vaccination clinic. And we've been really good about that. Okay, so we have, again, somewhere in the neighborhood of 46% or so of all Nebraskans that have gone in and received at least 1 vaccine. But now we need to make it more convenient. And so I know public health is working on this. I salute my colleagues in public health. They're doing a great job, and they're working just, yeoman's hours to get this done. But we need to now, instead of having people come to the vaccine, we need the vaccine to go to the people. And so that's starting. So, getting the vaccine out there in pharmacies, in clinics, in churches, in places where people are employed, or even going out to their homes for folks who really can't get out. Making this as convenient as possible will help. And then, at least in some workplaces, there's talk about trying to do some opt-out rather than opt-in vaccination. So in other words, if you are at a school or at a place of employment and you're given an appointment to show up to get your vaccine if you've not already received it, and you have to actively opt out of that rather than, again, making that appointment for yourself. We need to push back a bit about misinformation, and I've already tried to push back against some of the things that you hear about, with regard to the vaccine makes me sterile, or Bill Gates has somehow put a microchip into the vaccine. I mean, there are some crazy things out there, and we need to be pushing back against that information. But we also need to be very transparent with the information. And I've tried to do that with you today. Showing people that, yes, there are definitely, some side effects that you're going to get from this vaccine, or you might get from this vaccine. Those are known, those are expected. But, it has a really, really good safety profile, and it is very, very effective across the board in preventing this disease. So we need to debunk the myths, and we need to push back against some of these conspiracy theories and really get trusted information out there to the public. We need to push back against the distrust that has resulted from past bad behavior. So number one is we need to just own up to it. And we need to admit that you don't have to look very far to find bad examples of bad behavior. So whether this is, authority acting badly in policing, or whether it is past mistakes that were made with scientific and medical experimentation, the Tuskegee experiments being the classic example of that. We need to admit to it, and we need to do better. But the real tragedy right now is if we allow those past mistakes to create a current mistake. And the current mistake would be people opting not to get vaccinated because of their concerns about misuse of authority, or big companies or big government not, behaving well. And so I think that we need to own up to our past mistakes, try to do better, do better. We need to just do better. And we need to let people, make good informed decisions now, not influenced by bad behavior in the past. The approach to vaccine hesitancy when you have these discussions with parents is that you need to realize that simply telling people that their fears are unjustified is not going to help. And so you need to listen to them carefully, try to understand where they're coming from, and treat them with respect. Okay, so again, these are largely smart people who are tuning into information, and either they can be misled or they can have overblown fears. But trying to understand where those are coming from, and then giving them information that will help them to make a good informed decision. Being transparent and being accurate. And again, I've tried to do that today as much as I possibly can. We need to emphasize people's desire to do good. And so I think that's a powerful tool that most people actually want to be part of the solution. They want to help themselves, they want to protect their families, they want to protect their loved ones, and they want to help their community get through this pandemic. And the best way of doing that is to get vaccinated. And I think we need to continue to appeal to people's better angels. We need to appeal to their altruistic spirit and get them to accept vaccination. We also need to get them to understand that vaccination is the norm, that we are over 50% of people eligible for the vaccine having received it, and that's going to continue to go up. Most people want to be part of the in group, and we need to convince them that the in group are the folks who are getting the vaccine, and that if you're not getting the vaccine, well, you're the not cool people. The cool people have all gotten and got the vaccine. So we need to let people know that this is what you want to do to fit in, to be part of society, to be part of our culture, to be a good citizen, is to get the vaccine. And you can be a good example of this. So it is very powerful when people tell folks, hey, I got the vaccine. My family got the vaccine. Everybody I work with got the vaccine. We're all doing just fine. We want you to be protected, and we want you to get the vaccine too. So, again, using your own stories is a powerful message. I do not know a solution to the politicization of public health and this vaccine effort. I really just don't. It is an incredible shame that somehow getting a vaccine has become some sort of a political statement, that wearing a mask has become a political statement. We need to uncouple those things from, from public health, from politics. And the only way I know to do that is to, continue to speak the truth, to continue to look for candidates that, respect science, that respect public health, that want to do the best for society, and those that are willing to pander to voters, that are willing to exploit these things for their own political gain. We need to point that out, and we need to vote against them. And then I think something that might help in that regard is for people to understand how sometimes social media is being used for nefarious purposes, and that they are being manipulated oftentimes without their knowledge. And so there is some good information coming out that there are actually, just like the attempt to meddle in our elections, that there are the same attempts to try to get Americans to be polarized around issues like vaccination. And so the Russians, other governments are actively promoting controversy where no controversy should exist. And quite frankly, they don't really care if we get vaccinated or not. They just want us to tear each other apart in the arguments around vaccination or race or elections or politics or any number of other things. They have very sophisticated systems with these, what they call bots and trolls and other systems in which they try to amplify the controversy. And so they will just, again, without people's knowledge that they're being manipulated, they will retweet and they will resend these messages that make it look like there's this big argument out there when there isn't. There really is no argument that these vaccines work tremendously well. We also, after having given hundreds of millions of doses, really know what the side effect profile looks like. There isn't that controversy that is trying to be promulgated on people, and we need to point that out to folks, is that they need to be responsible consumers of information. And one thing is to be really skeptical about what you see on social media. Use trusted information sources that are giving accurate information, and listening to your crazy uncle that thinks that microchips are being put in the vaccine is not the responsible way to see this information or to share it with your friends. So again, serving as good examples, pointing out some of these things where people can be manipulated, I think is one way to go forward. And then I'll end with these quotes that nothing in life is to be feared, it's only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. And then WHO director said, be safe, be smart, be kind. I think these are good words to live by. So thank you for your attention. I know I've used up pretty much the whole hour. I'm sorry, I meant to leave some time for questions, but I'm happy if people want to stick with me. I'm happy to stay and answer questions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ruff, thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate it. And I think you've armed all of us with really great information that we can take back and share with others. We'll post this webinar and make sure people know where to find it. And I know I feel much more informed about what's going on related to COVID and the vaccine.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to your group. And again, I apologize for being so long-winded, but I don't know if we have any time for any questions or not, but if not, that's okay too.
I think that you have addressed the questions that people ask. The one question that we didn't get to that I saw was about how to find a vaccine and how to find a particular vaccine. I did a little bit of searching about that, and it looks like at vaccines.gov you can search for a vaccine by zip code and you can select which vaccines you're looking for.
Yeah, so if you have access to the internet, it's pretty easy. Just go on to the Nebraska site or the Douglas County site or whatever county you're in, and just go to their vaccine information. They give you hotline numbers to call. You can also go online and make appointments, but really all of these vaccine clinics now are just open for walk-ins. So there's here in Douglas County, we have 5 sites, and then there's lots of other sites as well. But you can go to any of those sites on the days that they're open and get your vaccine. For the most part, many pharmacies are now offering just walk in, get your vaccine. If you're taking your kid in to get vaccinated, you will need to accompany them because you're going to need to sign the consent form to give consent for your child to be vaccinated. And then, as I mentioned, we are working towards making this more convenient, and hopefully you'll start to be able to get the vaccine really in many, many different settings. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for your time. We know you are very busy doing really important work, and we just so appreciate the knowledge that you've shared with us today.
All right. Thanks so much, you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.